And he saluted it, and he said, "Lady, if you want to see me again, you'll have to turn around." I heard too of another soldier who was fighting in one of our more recent wars, which we'll not mention. And the commanding officer said to him, "This is a dangerous assignment. We're outnumbered 4-1, so fight." About a half hour later, he found this soldier leaning up against a tree, sleeping. He woke him up. He says, "Why aren't you fighting?" He said, "I killed my 4." I had a cousin whose husband was fighting across the sea in a war. He was a sailor, and he sent to her a photograph in which there were a number of sailors. And in the letter he said, "We're all going out to have a good time." Well, this friend of the family was with her and was looking at the photograph. And she got a magnifying glass. And she looked at the pictures of the sailors through the magnifying glass, finally satisfied herself, and sat down and wrote a letter to her husband. And it took her only 15 seconds to write it. This friend said, "Is that all you're going to write?" "Yes," she said, "that's all." "Read it." Do you know what the letter said? "Where's your wedding ring?" At that checkpoint Charlie, between East and West Berlin, there are all kinds of stories that are told, and one American soldier pulled a gag on the Russians, who were watching very carefully. Anyone who passed from one side to the other. Generally, the military could pass without much of an inspection. This particular day, this soldier was evidently concealing something, and he had his overcoat bunched in front of him, and the Russian said to him, "What have you got under your overcoat?" He opened it, and there were hundreds of little Russian dolls about that high. And the Russian said, "What are you doing with those?" He said, "These are dehydrated people, and when I get on the other side, I fill them up with water. It's the only way we can smuggle them out of Russia." At that same checkpoint, it seems, a man that every day for about a year was passing the checkpoint going into East Germany. And in his wheelbarrow, he had hay piled up about 6 or 8 feet high. And each day, the Russian let him pass. So, being naturally quick after 300 days, he said, "You must be smuggling something in." So he tore all the hay off the wheelbarrow. He said, "What are you smuggling in?" He said, "Wheelbarrows." Now, that's the lighter side. Now the serious side, and this is really serious. We're going to talk about various phases of war, and first of all, the rapidity of wars. How often do they come? I would advise you to get a pencil and write down some of these figures. Have you got your pencil? Now, here is the rapidity of some of the great wars of modern times with which we are very familiar. The rapidity between the Napoleonic and the Franco-Prussian War was 55 years. The interval between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I was 43. And the interval between World War I and World War II was 21 years. At a time when man has more and more of the material conditions for happiness, he's multiplying wars. There has been a war every 2.6 years of recorded human history. Of 185 generations, human generations, there have only been 10, just think of it, 10 out of 185 generations that have ever lived in warless days. Now, another way of looking at this is to take a bigger sweep. I don't want to make my angel work too hard. He's on union rules, and so I'm going to conserve his washings today. I'm going to give you the rapidity of wars in various nations in the last 500 years. How many times, for example, did Great Britain go to war in the last 500 years? 76 times. How many times did France go to war in the last 500 years? 61 times. How many times did Russia go to war? 63 times. Now, our history is not nearly that long, in that in our time there were 9 major wars. That for the rapidity of wars. That's not a superstition. There's a logic behind everything. As regards wars, we must speak of their tactics as well. And the most clever of all the nations today is Russia. Why is Russia more clever than any other nation, and particularly the United States? Well, when the United States goes to war, first of all, sends its armaments, its weaponry, and then it sends men. So we are really at war. What does Russia do? Russia sends its weapons, but not its men. It sends the guns, airplanes, cannons, and bombers. It keeps the Russians at home. It finds dupes in other nations to do the fighting. That is why, when any other nation goes to war, Russia can always appear as the lover of peace. And why? It hasn't any men fighting. It just has guns fighting. Russians don't kill anyone. It's only their machines that kill. This is something we must keep in mind whenever we hear talk of peace. Now, as regards peace, what hope are we to find in leagues of nations, United Nations, and so forth? Certainly we must have them. But it's well to go back and just ask ourselves, how successful are peace treaties? Between World War I and World War II, when we had the League of Nations, do you think that nations were interested in peace? Certainly they were. So they were busy signing treaties of peace. We'll not go to war. How many treaties of peace did they sign? 4,568 treaties of peace between World War I and World War II. And the year before World War II started, how many treaties of peace? 211. In other words, there is not much confidence to be put in the pledged word. You get one divorce for every 4 marriages, and you get broken international agreements too. Now that's the relationship of peace to war. Now we come to the title of this telecast. How much does it cost to kill a man in war? Now the cost is going to vary, of course, as time goes on. But let's go back to the beginning. At the first war, certainly it didn't cost very much. I mean, the war between Cain and Abel, all he had to do was just simply pull a branch off a tree and crack Abel over the head. Then the next weapon was a sword by Lamech. That probably cost a few cents in those days. But these were just wars between individuals. David fought Goliath, 5 stones and a slingshot. Now we come to some figures that were given to us by a Admiral Eccles, who made a study of this subject. You remember in high school when you studied the wars of Julius Caesar? Remember, all Gaul was divided into 3 parts. And remember his campaigns into Britain and to what is now France. How much did it cost Julius Caesar to kill a man? Are you guessing? $0.75. How much did it cost Napoleon sweeping through Europe? $700 a man. How much did it cost? World War I. $21,000. Despite the fact that this was done on a wholesale scale. How much did it cost World War II to kill a man? $200,000. How much does it cost to kill a man? What did it cost to kill a man in Vietnam? Here, it's a little different standard. It cost $1 million an hour. $1 million an hour. Suppose there are 24 men killed in a day. That's cost $1 million apiece. So you do your own arithmetic from this point on. And just read the number of men that are killed in any one day and divide that into 24 million, and you have your cost. What is our budget now for war? For war. 77 billion. $77 billion. How much for the reconstruction of our cities? 5 billion. Those are figures now that you can digest. Just think of how that money could be spent in other ways. Maybe in another telecast, we will give you some of the ways. Why do we keep it up? Well, fundamentally because there's a tremendous amount of selfishness, and also because there is probably, in our modern civilization, a great death wish. And today we're getting jittery about what? Oh, about nuclear energy. Throwing the earth off its axis. One single explosion. In 1949, Einstein was asked, "What do you think is the future of atomic energy?" He says, "Come back in 1969 and I will tell you." What was he thinking about? We're now at a stage in weaponry where one maniac can press a button. Nations are wiped out. Maybe the planet destroyed. Just a jittery man can do it. Happened once before. In the legend of the death of King Arthur, he and his son, Mordred, quarreled, then became bitter enemies. They organized armies. Kingdom was divided. Thousands of men lined up on either side. On these two opposing hills stood the army, one led by Arthur, the father, and the other by Mordred, the son. They looked at one another and they thought, what are we going to do? Kill one another? Kill thousands? So they decided to sue for peace. Mordred and Arthur, with a few dozen soldiers from each side, met in the valley. And they agreed on a treaty of peace. And just as they were about to sign the treaty of peace, a poisonous snake wrapped itself around the leg of one of the soldiers. He took out his sword, cut away the snake. The blade of the sword flashed in the sun, and the men on both sides thought that war was declared. And they rushed at one another. And there were only 4 survivors. They had a case of jitters. Somebody had pressed a button. Is there much difference between the flash of a blade in the sunlight, the flash of the energy that has been Promethean-like stolen from the sun? May God avert the possibility of jittery men and the abuse of an energy that should be used for peace and not war.
Bishop Sheen will return in a moment.
Fulton J. Sheen is indeed a man for all seasons. He walked a paced beat, allowing us to glimpse his nature and ponder its worth and to enjoy its presence. Bishop Sheen authored over 90 books. He broadcast countless radio and television programs and ministered in many parts of the world to people of every belief. As he said many times, it is not a unity of religion we plead for, but a unity of religion.
Is in the will, not in the intellect. Secondly, as regards others, look for the best. That is to say, in others. Third rule, look for the worst in ourselves. First of all, the possibility of character. I believe every single person in the world has just a certain amount of energy, and some are much more richly endowed than others with it. If we use an example from physics, we might say that certain people, for example, have what might be called 10 ergs of energy. They have just that much. And then others have 20, and others have 50 ergs of energy. The result is that they're able to go in the direction of goodness, and they're able to go in the direction of evil, too, with much greater rapidity and energy than others. And this energy, as I say, is not the same in every human being. I think that possibly any sinner is capable of being a great saint. And any saint is also capable of being a great sinner. Now let us give an example here of how this energy works. We say First of all, some have little energy, and they go in the direction, call this goodness. They have 10 units of energy here, and they only go in this much, either toward goodness or toward evil. Others have 20, and they go much more, either in the direction of goodness or the direction of evil. So that a person who has a great tendency toward evil can completely change and become very good, particularly with the grace of God. I believe that Lenin, who did so much to establish communism in Russia, just barely missed by a hair's breadth of becoming a St. Francis of Assisi. If he had only gone in the other direction, the direction of goodness, instead of the direction of revolution and hate, he would have been a great saint. And if St. Francis of Assisi had gone in the opposite direction, as he had gone in the direction of virtue, he would have been a Lenin. The secret, therefore, of character development is the realization of this power that there is in each and every one of us, for good and for evil. The monasteries, the religious houses, the places of asceticism throughout the world have in them actual saints, but potential devils. Any one of those persons, because they have so much character, if they ever let themselves go in the direction of pride, lust, or avarice, would become very vicious. And the penitentiaries are filled with individuals who have this great energy. And if someone could only lay hold of it and make them take the high road instead of the low, they would be our saints and our heroes and our great patriots. The point that I want to make is there's nothing wrong with passion and energy and strength, so long as it is properly channeled. Notice that our divine Lord, for example, when he wished to make a great apostle, laid hold of a bigot. Paul was one of the greatest bigots that ever lived. And only he who could ever hate like a Saul could ever love like a Paul. Our blessed Lord never extinguished, for example, the passions of a Magdalene. Only someone who was as vicious and as evil as Magdalene could ever become as virtuous as Magdalene. She has been called the 13th apostle. Her life has been such an inspiration in bringing men to goodness. Now, though some of us do not have as much energy than others, let us not forget that a person with only 10 units of natural energy can surpass a person with 100 units of natural energy if he calls upon God for an added source of energy, which God will give him on certain conditions. Then we can overcome all of the defects of our nature. And that power or energy of God is given freely, gratis. That is why it is called grace. Which brings us now to the rules for character development. One of the first rules of character training is to remember that character is in the will and not in the intellect. The intellect, or the brains, or the mind, is the seat of knowledge. The will is the seat of choices, loves, motives, and responsibilities. Almost all of education today is directed to the communication of knowledge and not to the development of character. It is the mind that is changed, that is trained, rather than the will that is developed. And every decision that we make, every deed that we perform, almost every word that we say, goes into the making of our character, either for good or evil. You remember seeing icicles form and a drop would fall upon the tiny little icicle and add to its substance and its quantity, and then more drops. And if the drops that fell were pure, the icicle itself would be pure. If the drops that fell were soiled and dirty, the icicle itself would be dirty. And so it is with character. All of our decisions pour down into its making. And if they're good acts, we turn out to be a good character. If they are evil, we turn out to be unhappy and frustrated and full of anxieties and fears. This will of ours is really the only thing in the world that is our own. God can take anything else away from us. He could take away our health, any wealth or possessions that we might have. The one thing that he leaves us, always our own, is our will. And people today really do not want their wills. They do not want their freedom. That sounds strange, but it is true. The tendency today is to shift responsibility for decisions onto something else. For example, a boy does something wrong, and they say, well, it's due to grade B milk, insufficient playgrounds, or those naughty ductless glands. Child itself is hardly ever to blame. The present tendency in the world today, actually, is to reduce all responsibility to something which is subhuman. For example, Marx says that we are what we are because of economic conditions. In other words, our free will amounts to naught. Responsibility has been nullified. The Freudian tradition, for example, would say that to a large extent we are not economically determined, but biologically determined. And then it is felt that if we can ever bring to the surface something that is hidden down here, just bring it to the surface, that we will be cured and we'll be good and normal. No, that does not follow. It does no good to analyze the constituency of the water that gets into the sinking ship. You do not explain the oak simply by analyzing the rotten acorn from which it came. The real seat of character is here in the will. And we must not surrender that responsibility to the masses, as Marx would have it, or to any kind of biological determinism. Because if our will is determined by forces outside of ourselves, we no longer will make amendment for our misdeeds. And no character will ever grow without a constant resolution toward amendment. Character, as a matter of fact, is made by very severe discipline. You've seen a sculptor at work on marble, and the sculptor will first of all take a heavy chisel, and then will cut away great, huge chunks of marble. And then with more delicate blows, he will begin to bring out the image until finally perhaps all that is needed to reveal it is just the brush of a hand. And in the training of character, we have certain tendencies in us that are evil, that have to be every now and then repressed. And no one single blow or act will do it. And we have to take this mallet of our will, this chisel of our determination, and we knock off huge, great chunks of selfishness. And then later on, with more refined detachment and asceticism of the spirit, we finally come to a point where our character is really revealed and we appear as we ought to be and as God intended us to be. So rule number one, then, is character is in our will. Rule number two, and this applies to character training in others, we must always look for the best that is in others. When people are down because they have sinned, because they have made a mistake, or because life is against them, or because they consider themselves failures, there is nothing that is more important than to give them the helping hand and to be, in their regard, an apostle of encouragement. There is something good in every single person of the world if we would only just lay hold of it. And notice that was what our blessed Lord did when he went to the well, tired and thirsty, one day, and a woman came out at noon to draw water. It was very unusual for a woman to come and draw water at noon. The explanation was she was an evil woman, and the other women would not allow her to come with them. Now, what common denominator was there between our divine Lord, who is innocence itself, and this woman who had 5 husbands and was living with someone who was not her husband? There was only one common denominator that was left. There was only one good thing in that character that our blessed Lord could find. And down he went until finally he found it. And that common denominator was a common love of a drink of cold water. Whenever God wishes to do a favor, he very often asks for one. And he asked her for a drink. And then he led her on from the thirst for natural water to the thirst of her own soul. He looked for what was best in her. When we see others, therefore, who are defeated or cast out by others, give them the helping hand. I remember a couple of years ago I was in Boston, and I was eating in the dining room of the Hotel Statler. And at noon I looked up and I saw 2 shoeshine boys that were leaning on a great purple curtain that was at the entrance of the dining room. These boys had on dirty T-shirts and crude shoeshine boxes thrown over their backs. Their hands, of course, were black both with dirt and with shoe polish. And as soon as the head waiter, the Statler, saw them, he says, "Get out of here!" So he chased the boys out. I left the dining room and went out after them. And I engaged them in conversation. And I said to one of them, we will call his name Johnny, though that is not his name. And I said, "Johnny, where do you go to school?" He said, "I go to such and such a school." But he said, "I was thrown out of this particular school." And he mentioned the name of some Catholic school he was thrown out of. And I said, "Why don't you go back?" He said, "They won't take me back." Well, I said, "Will you go back if I get you back?" He said, "You can't get me back. Nobody can get me back." Well, I said, "I can get you back." He said, "Who are you?" Well, I said, "I won't tell you who I am, but you just tell me the name of the sister and I will write to her and get you back." So I wrote to the good sister and I told her something I believe I mentioned on television some weeks ago about the 3 boys that were thrown out of schools, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. And I said, nobody knows who were the valedictorians of those particular classes, but who did not know Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. And I'm sure that the educators wish that they could take back those boys again. So why not take back Johnny and give him another chance? I see Johnny every now and then. He's a very, very fine young fellow, and, well, so very good I will not even talk about it now over the air, except to tell you that in all things we look for the best that is in other people. Remember when St. Paul went to the hill of the Areopagus in Athens? Here he was to meet the senators of Greece. And on the way up to this hill, everywhere he passed statues of pagan deities. St. Paul knew that he could never win over those senators with the higher life that he was preaching unless he found some common denominator with them, looked for something that was good in their lives. And when he addressed them, he did not give them an harangue about all of their pagan statues. Rather, he said, "Gentlemen, I perceive that you are religious. For I saw on the streets, your streets, a statue to the unknown God. That God whom you know not is the God whom I preach to you." It was the only thing that St. Paul could find, and yet it was all that he needed. And so, in dealing with other characters, find something that is good, like the poor street cleaner that died, and everyone abused him. Said he was unfaithful to his wife, and he was an alcoholic, and he was dishonest, and everything else. And one man, looking around for a common denominator and for the good things, said, I know all of those things, but he said he did sweep clean around the corners. And there must be in every single life some good little detail like that we can begin with and use it as the stepping stone for character formation. And finally, the last rule. We always look for what is worst in ourselves. We are all failures in one department of life or the other. And how do we know what is worst in ourselves? Well, by looking into our character, into our conscience. We all have one dominant fault. The 7 pallbearers of character, or the 7 dominant faults, are easy enough to analyze. They are pride, covetousness, lust, anger, envy, gluttony, sloth. Pride, egotism, selfishness, covetousness, desire of possessing that which belongs to others, inordinate love of flesh, lust, anger, hot-headedness, gluttony, overeating, sloth, laziness, and envy, and jealousy. If we would, after an examination of conscience, lay hold of this dominant fault of ours, we could make that the basis of the strongest part of our character. Sometimes the tooth that is filled is the strongest tooth in the head. St. Paul says, power is made perfect in infirmity. Perhaps I can explain that by telling you that some years ago, 2 boys in Kansas used to run to school every morning. They earned a few extra pennies, it seemed, by lighting the stove. This particular morning, by some mistake or other, gasoline was put into the can instead of kerosene, and the stove exploded, and one of the boys was burned so badly that they were told that he never would walk again. The boy began rubbing his legs, said he would walk again. The doctor said it was impossible. And yet he laid hold of that which was worst in himself, that which even seemed to be impossible, so concentrated upon it, that he perfected himself and he became one of the great milers of America, Glenn Cunningham. And so it is with character. And the good Lord would have us lay hold of what is worst in ourselves. Do not think that people who have virtue and kindness and other great talents for helping other people just came by these things naturally. They had to work at them very hard. You've often heard that Moses was meek. Yes, Scripture says he was the meekest man who ever lived, but Moses was not always meek. As a matter of fact, Moses once killed an Egyptian. And then after he was given the commandments, he came down and found his people adoring a brazen calf, and he smashed the tablets on a stone. He was the first one in the world to break all the commandments at once. Well, Moses, therefore, was a very hot-headed creature. So Moses had to work with his character. And finally, he worked on it until he became very meek. Now, the reason I speak about character training is because we're getting into a great world crisis, and it's becoming very serious. And in a crisis, what is going to come out is what is already in us. The woodsmen say that when a log is thrown into a fire, that it reveals all the colors that went into it as a tree, namely the purple of the dawn, the red of the sunset, the silver of the moon, the gold of the lightning, the darkness of the storm. And when the log is put into this crisis of fire, all of these colors come out. And so it is with character. All of our choices and decisions that have gone into the making of our personality will come out in a crisis. And a crisis is coming upon us. There is not much peace outside of us, and the only real peace that we can be sure of is the peace that is on the inside. And when we are building our character, we need some model on the outside, someone with justice and mercy and goodness and a spirit of sacrifice will inspire us to tear off these chunks of selfishness that we may be like unto him. For as he said, I have given you an example. May all the American characters begin to emerge now under the grace of God. As we continue to be a great nation, loving one another in a spirit of charity, loving God who made us and blessed us. God love you.
People of all faiths recognize Bishop Fulton J. Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life. His unique ability at being natural and at ease in front of any audience was noted early in his ministry. He was ordained in 1919 and went on to become one of the best-known and greatly loved priests in church history. He wrote 96 books and hundreds of articles and columns. He broadcast numerous radio and TV programs. People from all faiths watched him on television because he spoke to every man. They always waited with joy for his goodbye, his blessing, God love you. It continues to give us joy and memories.
Cavalcade of sports, which my husband wants to see. He gets his way. And in the meantime, a good program is lost forever from Bishop Sheen, and we fight and don't speak the rest of the evening. Now, he sees the cavalcade of sports, which is a fight program, and he fights with his wife. How many fights does he want a night? This is rather a difficult problem. I knew of a family that had a problem like it. They had a tiny little dog, and everybody wanted to play with the dog at once, so they exchanged it for a dachshund, so the whole family could pet it at once. Maybe the solution of the problem is for her to pray for a quick knockout, and then he'll turn over to our program. See, he has a trainer in his corner, and she has an angel in hers. But we'll try to make up for it. We will send to Mrs. McGuire a copy of all of the telecasts that she missed. This is the telecast of 2 years ago, and this is the telecast of last year. And we'll send both of these volumes so she'll get along well with her husband. And maybe the final solution might be inasmuch as Lent is coming on, for him to give up the fights, for her to give up Bishop Sheen, and both listen to Milton Berle. Well, we told you last week we were going to speak on the crises of the world, not from a political or economic point of view, but rather profoundly, in terms of has Christianity failed? That, of course, all depends upon what you mean by Christianity. there are certain types of Christianity that definitely have failed. And among those types, we will mention three forms of Christianity. The first is called the pink pill Christianity. The pink pill Christianity is one that substitutes a clinic for an altar, that gives an emotional glow, that analyzes and inspires, but it never saves. It attempts always to give some kind of psychological thrill without in any way touching the soul of a man. Then in addition to the pink pill Christianity, there is also ambulance Christianity. Ambulance Christianity runs after certain sick movements that need a bit of artificial respiration. For example, it gets behind art, science, the United Nations. There are some believers in ambulance Christianity who identify, for example, the kingdom of God with the defense of labor unions. And others identify the kingdom of God with capitalism. Finally, there is what is known as rumba Christianity. Now, I had to find out how to dance the rumba. I'm told that you move only from the hips down. Is that right? Well, if that is it, that's a very good explanation of a certain type of weak Christianity. Because the head does not move, nor the rest of the body, that means that there is considerable action without any thinking and without any deep sentiments of love. This is a kind of Christianity where if you write a nice article or you produce a good movie or you play a very good game of golf, you're supposed to be profoundly Christian. Now, these types of Christianity have failed, no doubt about it. And when Chesterton was once told that Christianity has been tried and found wanting, Chesterton's answer was, "It has been found hard, but not tried." I wonder if that's the real answer. It may really be that Christianity has been found easy and not tried. It's too easy. And the modern man is looking for something that demands sacrifice and a little discipline. Gives him something so sublime that he might die for it. Presents to him an evil that ought to be despised, such a sin. And simply because there's been a weak kind of Christianity that's identified with psychology and science and sociology, there's been a terrific void in the world due to the loss of faith. And the world cannot live in a vacuum, so it fills it up. And there's been a filling up of this void in two different ways. The emptiness has been filled up one way by the Western world, and another way by communism. First of all, the Western world. The Western world has filled up the vacuum by the individual man entering inside of himself. It used to be, during the days of faith, that men lived in a great and tremendous universe. A universe of three dimensions. A universe in which, for example, there was heaven and hell, and in between, the earth, in which man had to novitiate and was given a moment of time in order to say aye or nay to his eternal destiny. Men moved out of this great universe. They moved inside of themselves, inside of their own head. That's like a human modern head. And heaven has become the superego. This has become what the Freudians call the id, and the earth is the ego. The result is that man is living inside of himself. He's almost like a serpent devouring his own tail. The modern man has a scalpel in his hand. And he's constantly probing, digging at his own wounds without ever finding a healing. He is like one that is shot with bullets and feels that he can cure himself if he analyzes the bullet in order to discover if it was shot by Oedipus or by Electra. The modern man is like a ship that is beginning to sink. And he believes that if he makes an analysis of the water to determine its chemical constituents and origins, that he will thereby save the ship of self from sinking. Man's soul was meant to be like a cup. Cup lifted skyward. When it was raised by that voluntary act of man, God could fill it. But today this cup is upside down. Man has shut out everything else, the great environment of faith and divinity. He cannot fill the cup. Not even God can fill it. And he closes out the rest of the universe. And the modern poet has expressed this inversion, this passion for self-analysis, in these words which very well describe our modern man. I saw a creature, naked, bestial, squatting on the desert with his heart in his hand. And as he ate of it, I said, "Is it good, friend?" And he answered, "It is bitter. Bitter. But I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart." It's a queer way of filling up the void and the emptiness that has come from loss of faith in our modern world. But it's not the only way. The communists have another answer. While in the Western world man turns inside of himself, the communists would have humanity turn back upon itself. And the communists say to the men of the Western world, "You are discontented with your liberty. You talk of it, but you do not want it. And the reason you do not want it is because freedom implies choice, and choice implies responsibility. And you want to escape responsibility. That is what we do for you. You give us your freedom. Surrender your choice, so that from this point on there is no conscience but state conscience, no voice but party voice, no morality but totalitarian morality. You feel miserable, anxious, and fearful. You feel chaotic? We will organize all of this chaos of yours into a collectivity. For our socialism is nothing but the forcible organization of the chaos of your individual lives. And we will call this new party, this new mass, this collectivity, that is our God. And that is why we have to persecute. We have to. Because if you say you have a soul, then there's a part of you that does not belong to the state. Then there is a part of you that we cannot touch. So militant atheism is part of our program. And this is the way we fill up the void of the world. Those are the two answers of the world today. Are they hopeless? Should we despair? By no means despair. There is hope for both. First of all, there is hope for the modern man. For when the modern man goes down into the depths of his soul, he is in search of something. And what he is in search for is actually the limits of experience. He wants the extremes of living. And there he discovers that there are two extremes, either acceptance of God or defiance of God. He either there in the depths of his soul confronts God or he affronts him. One or the other. It is possible, as the Jewish psalmist said, to cry out of the depths. De profundis clamaveat te Domine. And this despair that the modern man has can be creative. Just as sickness can be creative when one sends for a physician. When the Western man says, I am hopeless, and then he looks for help, he is saved. He is not lost. This is not a despairing condition that our Western man is in. We are familiar, of course, with white grace, or the presence of God in the soul. But remember, there is also black grace. And black grace is the absence of God in the soul, or from the soul. And this loneliness, this fear, this anxiety, this terrific sense of isolation that he feels, this black grace is really the finger of God. It is stirring him unto uneasiness, so that if he does not come to divine beauty by standing on mountaintops, he can discover it out of the depths of his soul, as he hears in the language of Thompson, God speaking to him and saying, poor, piteous, futile thing, why should any set thee love apart? Seeing none but I make much of naught, he said. And human love needs human meriting, and how hast thou merited? Of all man's clotted clay, the dingiest clot. Alas, thou knowest not how little worthy of any love thou art. For whom wilt thou find to love ignoble thee? Save me. Save only me. And if there's hope for the Western man, there is hope also for the communist. I know. You say he's an atheist? Well, how many kinds of atheism are there? There are two kinds of atheism. One is the bourgeois atheism of the Western world, and the other is communist atheism. Bourgeois atheism is a denial of God based upon reading 15 pages of a comparative religion, reading some popularization of science, living under the illusion that one has read Darwin's Origin of Species, and a pretty good spicing of bad behavior. That is bourgeois atheism. Now, communist atheism is not of that kind at all. Communist atheism does not deny God. Communist atheism challenges God. The atheism of communism is an experience of God. Whence comes the fire, the militancy, the persecution, the hate, the violence of the communists against those who believe in God, if it be not the reality of God himself? Why these communists are not wasting their times on phantoms and ghosts and centaurs? They are witnessing by the very intensity and the impetuosity of their hate to the reality of that which they deny with their own lips. As one of our missionary workers in China was telling me, who was in prison for about 2.5 years. The communist guard would let her out to the prison yard by opening the door just a few inches. She would have to scratch herself. She wormed her way out, and he would spit in her face every day. One day she said to him, "Thanks." Coming back a little while later into her cell, he said, "Why did you say thanks?" She said, "Because now I know how our Lord felt when he was spat upon." And the communist guard opened the cell door wide to let her in. And she noticed that the tears were streaming down his cheeks at the revelation that he had received. As the salt of her own righteous tears were witnessing to her own joy. This is the crisis of our modern world, and it can be summarized, everything that we've said, in terms of light. I wish I had a match, but it's not necessary. Don't bother. If I had a match, I would light it here, and you can visualize two products. One product of all fire is light, and the other product is heat. In the mind, the light corresponds to truth. The heat corresponds to love. The two were always meant to go together. That is to say, when we had a certain truth, we were to love that truth. And the two are always equal. The Son and the Spirit are equal. But it happens in our modern world. There is a great and a tremendous divorce. A divorce between light and heat. Our Western world has the truth. The Hebraic Christian tradition in all of its fullness. But we have not the heat, the fire, the love, the enthusiasm. We have grown cold, sterile almost. The communists have fire. They have zeal. They have passion. They have a spirit of sacrifice. They're willing to surround the earth with their thinkers and their propagandists. They're burning with their philosophy. What a pity that the two are not together. Will they be together? Or will the light find the heat? or the heat the light. It is my guess that communism Russia rather will find the truth, because God can do something with fire and passion as he did with the fleshy passion of a Magdalene and the hate of a Paul. And when finally Russia discovers that truth with all of the fire and all of the zeal that it has, it will sweep over the Eastern world. And then we will know that Christianity has not failed.
People of all faiths recognize Bishop Fulton J. Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life. His unique ability at being natural and at ease in front of any audience was noted early in his ministry. He was ordained in 1919 and went on to become one of the best-known and greatly loved priests in church history. He wrote 96 books and hundreds of articles and columns. He broadcast numerous radio and TV programs. People from all faiths watched him on television because he spoke to every man. They always waited with joy for his goodbye, his blessing, God love you. It continues to give us joy and memory.